Hello, friends. Welcome to Storycraft. On this channel, you will enjoy world-top stories. Let's view the video. The town that vanished overnight in the Wild West, a boomtown, rises from the dust, the harsh, untamed land. Before it became a bustling town, this place was nothing but an endless stretch of dry, cracked earth. The wind howled through canyons, and the only signs of life were a few scattered cacti and the occasional rattlesnake. Few dared to travel through this desolate land, and those who did were either desperate or driven by dreams of fortune. Travelers told tales of eerie silence, of nights where the only sounds were the distant howls of coyotes and the rustling of unseen creatures in the brush. Water was scarce, the sun was relentless, and the promise of survival seemed like a cruel joke. Yet for some, hardship was simply the cost of opportunity. But everything changed one fateful afternoon when a lone prospector stumbled upon something that would alter the fate of this barren land forever. Gold. Gold fever strikes. The prospector, a man named Elijah Briggs, was no stranger to hardship. He had panned for gold in California, worked on railroads, and even fought in a few skirmishes. But when he knelt down at the riverbed and saw the unmistakable glint of gold peeking from the soil, his heart pounded with excitement. Briggs gathered what he could and hurried to the nearest trading post, eager to confirm his find. When the gold was weighed and verified, the news spread like wildfire. Within weeks, wagons rolled in from all directions, filled with men and women hungry for a fresh start. Some were grizzled miners with years of experience. Others were farmers, merchants, and gamblers, hoping to carve out their own piece of the American dream. By the end of the month, a makeshift settlement had sprung up around the river, tents and wooden shacks standing defiantly against the wilderness. Each day, more people arrived, bringing with them tools, supplies, and rumors of even larger gold, deposits hidden in the surrounding hills. Prospectors worked from dawn to dusk, their hands blistered from wielding pickaxes, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. Some struck it rich, walking into town with satchels heavy with gold dust, while others left with nothing but broken spirits. From tents to a thriving town, what began as a ragtag collection of miners' tents quickly evolved into something more permanent. Log cabins replaced flimsy shelters, and businesses started popping up overnight. A blacksmith set up shop, hammering horseshoes and tools for the miners. A general store stocked sacks of flour, pickaxes, and overpriced whiskey. And of course, saloons lined the main street, their swinging doors inviting weary prospectors inside for a drink, a game of cards, or a fight. The main street was a chaotic blend of opportunity and danger. Merchants hollered their prices from wooden stalls, children ran between horses and wagons, and outlaws eyed easy targets. At night, oil lanterns illuminated the town, casting flickering shadows against wooden facades, while piano music drifted from saloon windows, mingling with the shouts of drunken gamblers. As the town took shape, so did its identity. It was a place of opportunity, but also of lawlessness. There were no sheriffs at first, only the strong-willed and the quick-drawing. Law and disorder. With gold came greed, and with greed came crime. Gangs of outlaws roamed the outskirts, waiting to ambush. Travelers and stagecoach riders.
Shootouts became a common occurrence, and it was said that a man could be shot over something as trivial as a spilled drink or a bad poker hand. The law was a distant concept, enforced only by those who had the means to do so. At first, makeshift
justice was carried out by angry mobs. Thieves were caught, dragged through the dusty streets, and strung up from the nearest tree. The people called it frontier justice, a necessary evil in a place where lawmen were scarce and danger was everywhere. To restore order, the townspeople elected a sheriff, an ex-gunslinger named Thomas Dunbar. With a reputation for being both fair and ruthless, he quickly made an example of the first few outlaws who dared to challenge him. Dunbar was known for his sharp eye and steady hand, his revolver rarely missing its mark. He imposed curfews, banned public brawls, and formed a posse to patrol the town. Yet, even with Dunbar's iron grip, the town remained a place where fortunes were won and lost in the blink of an eye. A community forms. Despite the danger, families began arriving, bringing with them a sense of permanence. A schoolhouse was built, where a young teacher named Miss Abigail Hayes taught children how to read and write. A small church stood at the edge of town, its bell ringing every Sunday morning. Women and children walked the streets alongside grizzled miners, giving the town a warmth that had been absent in its early days. The town began to develop traditions. Festivals were held in the dusty square, where fiddlers played lively tunes and couples danced beneath the open sky. A newspaper was established, chronicling the town's successes and tragedies. Farmers tilled the soil outside the settlement, hoping to grow crops despite the harsh conditions. Every person had a role to play. The baker rose before dawn to prepare fresh bread. The doctor worked tirelessly to patch up wounds from mining accidents and gunfights, and the blacksmith kept the town's tools and weapons in working order. Though life was hard, there was a growing sense of unity, a belief that this town, once nothing more than dust and dreams, could become something lasting. Whispers of trouble. For all its promise, the town was not without its problems. The gold veins that had drawn people in were beginning to run dry. Some miners dug deeper, hoping for one last lucky strike, while others packed their bags and left in search of new prospects. Merchants worried as business slowed, and land disputes erupted as desperate men sought any means to stake their claim. Tensions grew between settlers and the native tribes who had long called this land home. Treaties were ignored, and skirmishes broke out along the outskirts. Some spoke of impending war, while others pleaded for peace. It was a fragile balance, one that could be shattered by a single act of violence. Then came the rumors, whispers, of something dark looming on the horizon. Strange lights seen on distant hills, unexplained disappearances, and an uneasy silence that seemed to settle over the town at night. Some dismissed it as paranoia, while others believed it was a sign that their days were numbered. It seemed like the town had finally found its footing, growing into something more than just a gold rush settlement. But fate had other plans. Something was lurking just beyond the horizon, something that would soon wipe this town off the map forever. Gold, greed, and gunfights. The lure of gold. The town was built on one thing: gold. It had drawn men from all walks of life, from seasoned prospectors to desperate drifters, willing to risk everything for the chance at fortune. In the early days, gold dust was so abundant that some claimed they could scoop it straight from the riverbed with their bare hands. But as word spread far and wide, the rush intensified. More men arrived daily, staking claims along the river and up into the hills, each hoping for their own strike. Campsites turned into bustling dig sites, the sound of pickaxes and hammers echoing through the valley. Yet, as more gold was pulled from the earth, tensions began to rise. Greed had a way of turning friends into enemies, and soon the town was no longer just a place of opportunity. It was a battleground. Rivalries and claims. At first, prospectors respected each other's claims, understanding that there was enough gold to go around. But as the easy pickings disappeared, men became desperate. Boundaries were ignored, claims were stolen in the dead of night, and disputes were settled not with words, but with bullets. One of the most infamous conflicts was between two rival mining groups, the Carson Gang and the Holloway Brothers. The Carson Gang, led by a ruthless ex-convict named Jed Carson, operated with little regard for the law. They bullied smaller prospectors, seized mining stakes, and weren't afraid to resort to violence. The Holloway Brothers, 3 former cattle ranchers, had made their own fortune but refused to be intimidated. When Carson's men tried to run them off their land, a standoff erupted. Shots were fired, and by the end of the night, 3 men lay dead in the dirt. The town's sheriff, Thomas Dunbar, tried to keep the peace, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. Gunfights became a daily occurrence, and for many, carrying a pistol was as necessary as carrying a pickaxe. Tukum of the saloons. With gold flowing through the town, saloons and gambling halls flourished. The largest of them all, the Gilded Horseshoe, was run by a former riverboat gambler named Silas McGraw. A shrewd businessman, McGraw understood that in a town full of gold-hungry men, vice would be the most lucrative trade of all. His saloon became the center of the town's nightlife, a place where fortunes were made and lost over a single hand of poker, and where whiskey flowed freely until the sun came up. But the saloons weren't just places of entertainment. They were also places of danger. Drunken disputes turned into brawls, which often ended in bloodshed. Cheating at cards was a death sentence, and McGraw had no patience for troublemakers. He employed his own enforcers, men who could break bones as easily as they could shuffle a deck. Women, too, played a role in this dangerous world. Some came seeking fortune like the men, while others were forced into the saloons as entertainers or worse. Among them was a woman named Lily Fontaine, a singer whose voice could silence even the rowdiest crowd. But behind her soft melodies was a sharp mind, and she knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of men driven mad by gold. A town on the brink. Despite the violence, the town continued to thrive. New businesses opened, homes were built, and for a time, it seemed as if civilization was beginning to take root in the wild frontier. But beneath the surface, tensions boiled. Every day brought another feud, another robbery, another gunfight in the dusty streets. Then came the heist that changed everything. A group of outlaws, led by the infamous bandit known only as Black Jack, rode into town one fateful evening. They struck fast, robbing the town's largest gold depository and making off with a fortune before disappearing into the hills. The robbery sent shockwaves through the town. Some suspected it had been an inside job, that someone had tipped off Black Jack to the shipment's arrival. Fingers were pointed, accusations flew, and before long, the town was spiraling into chaos. The gunfight that shook the town. Desperate to reclaim order, Sheriff Dunbar gathered a posse to track down the outlaws. For days, they scoured the hills, finding only abandoned campsites and whispers of the gang's movements. But when they finally caught up to Black Jack's men, it led to one of the deadliest shootouts the town had ever seen. Gunfire erupted in the narrow pass of Devil's Hollow. Dunbar and his men fought fiercely, but the outlaws were prepared. When the dust settled, several lawmen lay dead, and Black Jack had vanished once more, leaving behind nothing but blood-stained earth. The loss was a heavy blow to the town. With their sheriff wounded and morale at an all-time low, the once thriving Boomtown teetered on the edge. People began to question whether the gold was worth the cost, whether the promise of fortune was worth the ever-present threat of violence and death. Little did they know, their troubles were far from over. The worst was yet to come, the mysterious disappearance. A town on edge. The once thriving town, built on gold and ambition, now stood on shaky ground. After the devastating outlaw heist and the gunfight that left several dead, fear and paranoia gripped the people. Businesses still ran, but the sense of prosperity had been tainted. The saloons were quieter, conversations more hushed, and the once busy streets seemed emptier with each passing week. Rumors began to spread, whispers of something more than just bandits lurking beyond the hills. Some claimed to have seen strange lights in the dead of night. Others spoke of eerie noises carried by the wind, sounds that didn't belong to any animal known to the land. But it wasn't until people started vanishing that the town truly began to unravel. The first to vanish it started with the miners, men who ventured into the hills alone and never returned. At first, people chalked it up to accidents, cave-ins, exhaustion, or perhaps a lone outlaw picking off easy targets. But then it wasn't just miners. A merchant named Samuel Reed was the first townsman to disappear. He had left his shop at dusk, heading to his cabin on the outskirts. By morning, his home was empty. The door was ajar, his dinner untouched on the table, and his horse still tied up outside. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. As more people vanished, prospectors, travelers, even a family of settlers, the town's fear turned into outright panic. Some packed their bags and left under the cover of darkness, unwilling to risk becoming the next victim of whatever unseen force was at work. The search party. Desperate for answers, Sheriff Dunbar, still recovering from his injuries, assembled a group of men to search for the missing. The posse, armed to the teeth, rode out at dawn, scouring the hills and canyons where the disappearances had occurred. What they found only deepened the mystery. In an abandoned mining shaft, they discovered the belongings of several missing men, boots, tools, and even a pocket watch belonging to Samuel Reed. But there were no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, just eerie silence and the cold weight of unanswered questions. Further up the hills, they came upon something even more unsettling. Markings carved into the rock, strange symbols that none of them recognized. They weren't letters, nor were they like any native carvings they had seen before. Some of the older townsfolk whispered about ancient legends, tales of spirits that roamed the land long before the first settlers arrived. Dunbar and his men returned to town, empty-handed and haunted by what they had seen. The disappearances weren't the work of outlaws. This was something else, something far more terrifying. Panic and desperation. As word of the failed search spread, the town descended into chaos. People turned on each other, searching for someone to blame. Some accused the few remaining native tribes in the area, demanding retribution. Others suspected a secret outlaw gang, hiding in the hills and picking people off one by one. A preacher named Father Callahan warned that the town had been cursed, that their greed and violence had angered something ancient. He urged the people to repent, to leave before it was too late. Many laughed at him, until Father Callahan himself disappeared one night, his church doors swinging in the wind, his Bible left open on the pulpit. Fear gripped every household. People locked their doors at night, kept their guns close, and refused to step outside after sunset. Businesses shut down, and even the saloons, once the heart of the town's nightlife, stood nearly empty. A final warning. One night, a rider came into town, his horse lathered in sweat, his face pale as a ghost. He was one of the few survivors of a wagon train that had been making its way through the valley. He spoke of shadowy figures in the night, of an unnatural silence that had fallen over their camp before his companions simply vanished. No screams, no struggle, just gone. He had barely escaped, riding hard through the night, never looking back. His warning was clear. Something unnatural was at work, and if the town wanted to survive, they had to leave. By morning, half the fee, town had packed up and fled. The beginning of the end. For those who remained, there was only dread. The disappearances continued, and soon, it wasn't just people vanishing. Buildings stood empty, doors swinging open, the interiors left untouched. It was as if the town itself was being erased, piece by piece. Sheriff Dunbar, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, vowed to stay until he found the truth. But even he couldn't ignore the growing sense that something unseen was closing in, waiting for its moment to strike. No one knew when the town's final night would come, but deep down, they all felt it approaching. The final days of a doomed town. A ghost town in the making, the once thriving boomtown was now little more than a whisper of its former self. The streets, once alive with the sounds of merchants shouting their prices, drunken gamblers laughing over poker hands and pickaxes striking rock, had fallen eerily silent. Many of the businesses stood abandoned, their doors swaying in the wind, their interiors left untouched, as if the owners had vanished in the middle of their daily routine. Only a handful of people remained, those too stubborn, too poor, or too brave to leave. Sheriff Thomas Dunbar, ever the lawman, refused to abandon his post. The saloon owner, Silas McGraw, kept his establishment open despite having barely a handful of customers. And a few miners still clung to the dream of finding one last gold strike before they too would be forced to move on. But the disappearances continued, and those who remained knew they were living on borrowed time. An uneasy silence. The air was thick with tension. People spoke in hushed voices, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. At night, no one ventured outside. Windows were shuttered, guns were kept loaded, and families huddled together in the dark, listening for any sound that might signal that they were next. Stranger still, animals began to vanish, just as the people had. Horses tied up outside went missing without a trace. Dogs that once roamed the streets freely were nowhere to be found. The birds that had once nested in the eaves of buildings had disappeared altogether. It was as if the town itself was being erased piece by piece. Then one evening, a blood-curdling scream cut through the silence. By the time Dunbar and the remaining townsfolk rushed to investigate, all they found was an abandoned cabin with the door swinging open and the faintest hint of footprints leading out into the darkness. Footprints that ended abruptly, as if the person had simply ceased to exist. The last stand. Dunbar, along with the few remaining men in town, decided to make a stand. If something, or someone, was taking the people, they would be ready. They formed night patrols, taking turns watching the streets. They barricaded doors, reinforced windows, and sat with their rifles, waiting for whatever was coming. For 2 nights, nothing happened. The town remained eerily still, as if whatever force had been at work had finally decided to move on. Some began to hope that perhaps the nightmare was over. Then came the 3rd night. The church bell rang out in the dead of night, its haunting chimes echoing through the empty streets. But no one had rung it. Dunbar and his men rushed toward the church, weapons drawn. The doors stood wide open, the pews empty, and the pulpit abandoned. And yet, in the center of the church, carved into the wooden floor, was a symbol, one that matched the strange markings found in the hills. Then, the lanterns inside flickered and went out, and the screams began. The vanishing by sunrise, the A. Town was empty. Buildings still stood, their walls whispering of the lives that had once filled them. The sheriff's office still held an open ledger, the saloon still had whiskey bottles behind the bar, and the blacksmith's hammer still rested on the anvil. But there were no people, no bodies, no blood, just an empty town, frozen in time, as if its inhabitants had simply ceased to exist overnight. Travelers passing through would later report that the town looked abandoned but untouched, as if it had been deserted in an instant. Rumors spread of ghosts haunting the empty streets, of strange shadows moving in the windows, and of a chilling feeling that settled over anyone who dared to linger too long. The town that had once been full of life had vanished, leaving only stories whispered in the dark by those who dared to remember. The Forgotten Town's Legacy. The place where the town had once been was now a barren patch of land, overrun with scrub and cactus. Nothing remained but the skeletons of buildings, their foundations long since eroded by time and the harsh elements. No gold was left, no treasure. The dreams of fortune and wealth that had brought so many to the town were now just faded memories. Thanks for watching. Subscribe our channel Storycraft for more interesting videos.